let's start with the corset. First of all, we need to make some calculations to alter the initial pattern after the sizes of the client. We print out the sheets of the initial pattern with the printer parameter set at actual size, or 100%, and portrait orientation. Let's open the automatic table Calculation of Pattern Alteration on the computer. Before entering the measurements of the client, I recommend getting to know the initial pattern. If you can spend some time and make a mock-up according to the initial pattern, it will be great. In this case, you can measure the mock-up pieces and compare them with the initial measurements, mock-up measurements of the table. If you have any changes, you can always change any value in the column Mock-up Measurements. You can always get back to the initial values by pressing the button Back to Initial Parameters or Reset to Initial Parameters. The table will get back to its initial values. If you don't want to make the mock-up, which is a pity, you can be guided by my figures in the column Mock-up Measurements. It seems so simple at first sight. You enter all necessary measurements into the automatic table, receive all alterations to the initial pattern straight away, make all alterations, and start cutting and sewing the garment. Before alteration of the initial pattern, after the measurements of the client, I would like to discuss in detail about one of the measurements: distance between bust points. The thing is that the dress for this course has a sew-in cup and boat neck. These are the patterns of the cups. Sheet 3 comprises the central piece with and without seam allowances, and Sheet 4 comprises of the side piece with and without seam allowances. I want to review the distance between bust points measurement in detail and answer one rather frequent question: how can I achieve the tight fit of boat neck, strapless, or mask and make cleavage? You might understand that it is about the straight necklines, which are located quite far from the bust line. I will demonstrate on the dress form what I mean. So, we sew the corset with a high neck. The garment without cleavage might lead to undesirable and ugly effect when the corset is not tight to the body. This effect is often called a round, prominent chest. Women with smaller busts are concerned more often about such effect. As a rule, a fuller bust fills the corset, and such effect is less noticeable, and they are less concerned about it. However, I met some clients with a full bust who wanted to have a compulsory cleavage on their corset. However, it is necessary to consider that this cleavage looks absolutely natural on women with a smaller bust. But on larger-sized garments, it might look ridiculous if you overdo it and make it close to the body. I can compare such a corset with a landscape. The corset will look like two big hills with a huge ravine between them. This example is to show that even if your client asks to have a wavy shape in the bust area, you should make a moderate cleavage so that your corset looks natural. Certainly, you should involve your experience, your intuition, and design ideas in this case. The most correct is to use the mock-up of the pattern altered for this particular client. In this case, you will understand how deep this central dart should be. I hope you understand that it is extremely difficult to achieve the desired shape of the corset with cleavage using the patterns of the single-cut corset. At least, you need to have a middle front cut to have cleavage. Sometimes, for small sizes, a horizontal underbust dart between the curves can assist to create the cleavage. This dart should not be deep. only 1 to 1.5 centimeters. Besides, it can be made only on the lining, and the upper layer should be stretched to achieve soft transition in the bust line. However, only the underbust dart cannot be helpful for the fuller bust. You should have some seams along the front, center, and underbust. That's why for our dress with the boat neck, I suggest the cups cut along the central seam. If you want to check the front pattern of the corset before cutting and sewing, use the light box or put the parts one over another against the light. You will notice that I have already made the underbust darts in the side and central pieces along the lower cut of the cups. Besides, when you align the patterns, you will notice that the cups will be attached at an angle to the corset front. All these alterations are necessary to make the cleavage. You can see how many darts I need to make to have a perfect fit of the cups. Therefore, please don't alter the initial pattern after the measurements of your client without making the preliminary mock-up. Try different options, especially if it is a large size, with the bust circumference over 96 to 98 centimeters. Such a bust is rather big for the sew-in cups. Control the beauty of the cleavage at the stage of the mock-up made according to the altered patterns. The initial pattern, suggested in this course, has one more peculiarity. Now I get back to the bust center measurement. Let me remind you that distance between bust points is measured between protruding bust points. This measurement comprises 17 centimeters on the dress form with the body shape of the client. In our case, if we provide for the cleavage, the bust line will count for it and comprise about 18 centimeters. This is certainly considered in the patterns. In the central cup piece, the distance between the highest point of the bust to the center is the distance from the center to the highest point with the cleavage. This distance on the pattern comprises 8.8 to 9 centimeters, i.e., the depth of cleavage is already counted for. You need to remember and know that the distance between bust points is measured along the straight line, and it is equal to 17 centimeters. However, if you place the measuring tape along the cleavage, the length of the line becomes 18 centimeters. This is an important comment, which I should mention, otherwise there can be errors. For example, when you measure the initial patterns, you will notice that the bust line is 18 centimeters. However, you should understand that this value is not the distance between bust points, which is 17 centimeters indicated in the table, and measured without the dart for the cleavage. Thus, when you change the initial patterns after the measurements of the client, you need to check this point carefully. Once again, at the end of the tutorial, I want to emphasize that the mock-ups made according to the altered patterns are the best help for such cups and corsets.